Okay, thanks very much. Um, so I think one thing that took a lot of people by surprise during this pandemic was just how unprepared even the organizations that you'd expect to be prepared were for the pandemic. One thing that interested me was how unprepared they seemed to be to speak about a pandemic. So there were various kind of missteps in the way they spoke. Quite famously, towards the start of the pandemic, someone from the WHO conflated the disease, COVID-19, with the virus that causes the disease. And that still has ongoing effects. For example, in anti-vaccination groups, people sometimes say that the vaccine hasn't been proven as effective against COVID-19 because they didn't test people in the vaccination group for the virus, even though the results quite clearly show that the vaccine is effective at preventing the disease. Now, I'm interested in a slightly different kind of, let's charitably call it a misstep in the way some people have communicated about COVID-19. And I'm interested specifically in the issue of generic generalizations. So what are generic generalizations? Well, they're generalizations like this: women are bossy, mosquitoes carry malaria, young people don't vote. So what's interesting about these cases is they don't include a word like all or sometimes, or a comparative like as much as seniors, that tell you just how many women, mosquitoes, or young people you're talking about. So to take the first one, for example, this sexist generalization, if someone says all women are bossy, we can very easily disprove what they're saying. We just need to identify a non-bossy woman. But when they just say women are bossy, it becomes far less clear just what we need to do to falsify the generic. In general, generics seem to be tolerant of exceptions. So young people don't vote, for example, doesn't seem to mean that young people never vote. To give pretty clear examples, chicken lay eggs seems true, even though not all chickens lay eggs. So the cases I'm interested in, these bare plural generics, are characterized by an absence of clarity as to just how many members of the kinds, women, mosquitoes, young people, we're talking about, and a tolerance of exceptions. Generics are extremely useful when communicating about complex topics. They're extremely simple, and they appear quite regularly in scientific communication. So don't bother reading what I have here at results. This was just taken without much thought from a recent draft of a paper that's available online. And you can see that their results section is relatively complex, especially to someone who doesn't know anything about statistics. But the title of the paper, at least in this draft, was quite simple: face masks prevent transmission of respiratory diseases. So this is just an example of the kind of complex results that can be quite clearly, the key points can be quite clearly indicated by using a generic generalization. It avoids all the need for talking about complex statistics. But there are also downsides to using generics. And in particular, generics seem to be particularly apt for misinterpretation. So here's a quote that was quite widespread in the news media from Daniel Koch of the Swedish Federal Office for Public Health. And he said in a discussion about Switzerland relaxing, did I say Sweden before? Switzerland, about relaxing their restrictions to allow for old people, grandparents, to hug their grandchildren. And he said, children are practically not infected, and above all, do not spread the virus, which is a translated from German. So I'm particularly interested in this generic: children do not spread the virus. which was quite widely reported in the media. Now we can ask, what was it that Koch intended to communicate by using this generic? Did he mean that children do not generally spread the virus? That is, if a child is infected, it's unlikely they're going to spread it. Did he mean that children don't spread the virus as much as adults? Or did he mean that children do not ever spread the virus? These all seem kind of admissible interpretations of children do not spread the virus. And if you're having difficulty seeing the second reading, imagine it with a bit of stress on children. Children do not spread the virus. So each of these seems admissible interpretations, and I'm particularly interested here in the third one, or the distinction between the first and the third, say. So in a few newspaper reports, he was reported as having expressed that children cannot pass on the virus. And we can see here in a tweet from someone replying to someone who was talking about this quote, that's the kind of info I've been waiting for. Hopefully this gets more press so my son can go to school in the fall. And I think this quote, this tweet, indicates an important difference between these interpretations. So if children cannot spread the virus, then there seems no rationale for keeping schools closed. There's no risk of transmission between children and from children to adults, so you might as well open them. If, however, children don't generally spread the virus, there might still be a rationale for keeping schools closed, because even if transmission rates are much lower amongst children, once you bring all these children together, there's the potential for some really significant transmission to happen. So why is it that generics seem so apt for misinterpretation or include this kind of vagueness that allows for many viable interpretations? Well, the standard view of generics is that they semantically determine claims about the world in much the same way that quantified generalizations do. So just as all children are short, for example, makes a claim about the group of children that we can go and verify in the world, so the claim is that generics make claims about the world, although slightly more complex ones than universally quantified statements. And it's thought that they, on the standard view, that they do so because they actually have an implicit operator that functions much like a quantifier, this gen operator that you can see in the bullet point. And gen plays a similar role despite not having been explicitly pronounced as a quantifier. But then we can ask, why is it that generics then admit so many different interpretations and have this potential for miscommunication? If they have this operator in there and we use that when we're interpreting, why is it that we can't express that in a word so that we allow for all this misinterpretation? Explicitly quantified statements too have a certain vagueness in some cases. So if I say many children spread the virus, we can disagree about what many involves. But you wouldn't mistakenly report me as having said that all children pass the virus. Or if I said few children can transmit the virus, you wouldn't mistakenly report me as having said children cannot pass the virus. So there seems to be a degree of vagueness, a kind of qualitative vagueness that generics instantiate, but explicitly quantified statements don't. Now, I'm not going to be relying on this standard view of generics. I think there are things that you can say. So Rachel Turpin, for example, endorses a context-sensitive view of gen, on which it can admit quite extreme context sensitivity. But I'm going to take another tack in trying to explain this. Sarah Jane Leslie has argued that generics express what she calls default generalizations. And what she means by this is that humans have an innate cognitive mechanism for associating kinds and properties that allows us to generalize from an early age. So children can generalize before learning language. If you teach a child that objects of a certain appearance are rattles, they'll pick up a novel one and shake it, expecting it to make a noise. They've generalized the property of rattling to a kind. And they can do that before learning language, which seems to indicate there's something innate about it. Likewise, they can use generics well before they learn to use quantifiers. So children will speak using generic language before they start using even simple quantifiers like some or all. And Leslie wants to explain that by saying that when they use a generic, they're giving voice to an innate capacity for generalization that they didn't have to learn. They learned how to express it, but they didn't have to learn to generalize. Whereas to generalize universally or existentially, they do have to learn to do that. Now, Leslie takes a truth conditional approach, suggesting very roughly that a generic is true just in case our the mechanism of default generalization associates a relevant kind with a property. But I think there's another way we can interpret this interesting work, which is to say that generics are primarily expressive. And rather than trying to define what I mean by expressivism, I'll give it an example of it. So just as take the words ouch and I just cut my finger, they both express or can be used to express pain that the speaker has. But I just cut my finger seems to describe the world in a way that ouch doesn't. Ouch just directly expresses the pain the speaker is feeling, whereas I just cut my finger describes the pain. And my suggestion is that generics are a bit more like ouch than I just cut my finger. When we use generics, we express associations that we have made. We don't describe ourselves as making these associations, we just express them directly. But of course, generics can, and we always think of generics, I think, as describing the world. And but I think on this expressivist view, we can still capture the way generics describe. So ouch can be used to communicate that you just cut your finger, especially if you indicate the wound when you say it. Ouch, I can use that to let you know that I cut my finger. And one way of explaining that is that when people intentionally express states, mental states like pain, their audience seeks for an explanation for why they've expressed it. And one reason for saying ouch is that you've just hurt yourself or just cut your finger. I could also use it, say, if I've seen someone fall on TV, I could say ouch, and that might indicate something about my mental state that isn't merely feeling pain. But what I'm trying to communicate is not entirely clear. It's quite underdetermined. I might mean that I think they've hurt themselves. I might mean that seeing them fall has caused a slightly kind of vicarious pain in me. I might mean that that would hurt me if I were to fall like that. These are all good explanations for why I say ouch when I see someone fall on the TV. And likewise, when someone intentionally produces a generic, they express a kind of association, but because they've done so intentionally, the audience seeks for a reason. What's the purpose? What are they contributing by expressing this? And there are a great many potential explanations. If I say K's are F, it might be that I think K's are usually F, that they're always F, that being F is characteristic of K's, that only K's are F. These are all good explanations for why I produce the generic. Now, in many cases, it doesn't matter which of these interpretations we alight on. Just as when I say, ouch, seeing someone fall on the TV, you're not going to say, what do you mean? Do you mean that you're experiencing a vicarious pain, or do you mean that you think that person hurt themselves? It just doesn't matter for what's going on. And the speaker likely doesn't intend any particular one of those. Likewise, when we use generics, there's a similar kind of underdetermination, both at the level of the audience's inference and the speaker's intention, and it often doesn't matter for communicative purposes. So here's the question that Koch was trying to answer when he said, children don't spread the virus. Should grandparents be allowed to hug their children? And the answer that was being given in that press conference was yes, the Swiss government has decided to allow it. So we can see here two different interpretations. Children do not ever spread, and children do not generally spread COVID. On the first one, I think it's pretty clear the answer should be yes. If children don't ever spread the virus, then hugging should be allowed between grandparents and grandchildren. The grandchildren don't present any risks to the grandparents. We might quibble about the second one. We might think that even if children don't generally spread COVID, hugging between grandparents and grandchildren still presents a risk and shouldn't be allowed. But for charity, let's assume that the answer there is yes as well. If children don't generally spread COVID, then grandchildren should be allowed to hug their grandparents. The problem, however, is that this generic utterance was used then in talking about different questions. In particular, should schools reopen? And what do the different interpretations say here? Well, if children don't ever spread COVID, like I suggested before, then schools should reopen. There's no risk from children mingling in schools. But if children don't generally spread COVID, then it's far less clear that yes is the correct answer to the question, because while not generally spreading COVID, they spread to some extent. And if that spread is accentuated through lots of children meeting up with children and with teachers and with parents, then the COVID spread could be quite serious. So supposing that Koch meant this generally interpretation, it might have given a perfectly fine answer to the first question. But on the second question, it provides an answer that perhaps Koch wouldn't want to endorse, which is that we should reopen schools. Okay, I'll wrap up there. So I've suggested that generics have a useful role to play in scientific communication. They're extremely simple, and that's really useful for talking about complex scientific data. And I wouldn't want us to give up on that. But we should be aware that they're apt to be misconstrued, especially when they're removed from the context in which they're given. And I've briefly suggested that can be explained by an expressivist account. So just to make some very modest proposals for how we should go forward, I think communicators should be careful about using generic language when talking about scientific data. They should pay attention to the ways that the generics might be interpreted in the context in which they're speaking, but also they should pay attention to the questions that they might use to be answered in other contexts. And if Koch had phrased himself a bit more carefully, maybe we would have avoided this problem. Journalists should also be careful about two things. The first is elaborating on generic claims. A lot of newspaper reports reported just by directly quoting the generic that Koch used, but others provided elaborations like adding the word cannot. And they should also be careful about repeating these claims while removing them from their original context, so that other people looking for an answer, say, to the question of whether schools reopen, might stumble across this generic and think it supports that.